The air in the Redwood County Farmers Trust was thick with the scent of stale coffee and new money. It was a smell Jedediah Stone was getting to know, but one he never got used to. He stood at the teller's window, his knuckles white as he gripped the counter's polished marble edge. His hands were clean, scrubbed with boraxo until the skin was raw, but the grease from a lifetime of repairs was ground so deep into the lines of his palms, it was part of him now. "That should do it, Mr. Henderson," Jed said, his voice low and steady. He pushed a check across the counter, the final payment on his spring operating loan. It wasn't a big loan, just enough for seed and fertilizer, but paying it off in July felt like shucking a heavy winter coat on the first warm day of May. Mr. Henderson, a man whose own hands were as soft as the leather on his chair, picked up the check with 2 fingers, as if it were a soiled thing. He adjusted his spectacles and gave Jed a thin, practiced smile. "All settled, Jedediah. Prompt as always. But you know we could do so much more for you. The way grain prices are looking, this is the time to expand, to modernize." Before Jed could answer, the bank's heavy oak door swung open, letting in a slice of the humid summer heat and the booming voice of Rick Vance. Vance filled the doorway, not just with his size, but with an aura of restless ambition that seemed to suck the quiet right out of the room. He was wearing a brand new pair of jeans, creased in all the right places, and a dealership cap that still had the cardboard liner in it. "Henderson, you old bean counter," Vance bellowed, slapping a thick folder of paperwork onto the counter next to Jed's elbow. "The papers are signed. The wire transfer went through. She's getting delivered this afternoon." Henderson's smile widened into something genuine. "Richard, excellent news. Congratulations. This is a big step. A wise investment." Jed glanced at the folder. The logo on the front was a word he'd only seen in the glossy pages of farm magazines. Steiger. "What did you get, Rick?" Jed asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Vance turned, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked Jed up and down, taking in the worn flannel shirt and the faded jeans with a patch on the knee. It was the look of a man comparing a brand new dollar bill to a crumpled old one. "The new Tiger II, Jed. 4-wheel drive, articulated, 320 horsepower of Detroit diesel muscle. Pulled the trigger on a 50-foot field cultivator to go with it. I'll be able to work a quarter section before you can get that old 2-popper of yours started." Jed just nodded. He knew the tractor Vance was talking about. It was a monster, a green giant that cost more than his entire farm was worth, more than his father had earned in his whole life. "That's a lot of machine," Jed said simply. "It's the future," Vance shot back, leaning on the counter. "You can't make money in the 70s trying to farm like it's the 50s. Henderson here understands. You gotta use the bank's money to make money. Leverage, they call it." He winked at the banker, who beamed in return. Henderson cleared his throat and turned his attention back to Jed. "Richard is right, Jedediah. We've run the numbers. With a tractor like that, you could easily take on another 300 acres. We could have you approved for a new John Deere, maybe a 4630, and the land loan to go with it by the end of the week. You're leaving money on the table, son." Jed felt a familiar tightening in his gut. It was the same pitch he'd been hearing for 3 years, ever since grain prices started climbing to the moon. Buy more, borrow more, get bigger or get out. It was the new gospel of the American heartland, and every farmer in the county was a recent convert. Every farmer but him. He picked up his paid-in-full receipt from the counter. The paper felt solid in his hand, real. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Henderson, but I'm doing all right with what I've got. My 4020 still puts the seed in the ground, and my Gleaner F still gets the corn out of the field." Vance laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound. "That old deer? How many hours you got on that thing, Jed? 100,000? And that gleaner? My grandpa had one of them. It's a museum piece. You spend more time wrenching on that junk than you do farming." "Maybe so," Jed said, turning to leave. "But when I turn the key, it's my key. When I fix a busted hydraulic line, I'm paying myself, not a mechanic. And when I go to sleep at night, the only thing I owe is a prayer of thanks for the rain." He walked out of the bank, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Vance and Henderson to their world of leveraged assets and long-term debt. The afternoon sun hit him, and he took a deep breath. The air smelled of freshly cut alfalfa and diesel fumes from the county road. It smelled like freedom. He climbed into his old Ford pickup, the one with the mismatched fender and the seat springs that were starting to poke through the vinyl. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove the long way around, past Vance's place. And there it was, sitting in the yard, dwarfing the barn and the house and a brand-new combine, was the Steiger. It was immense, an unnatural shade of lime green, with 8 enormous tires that were taller than he was. It looked like something built to wage war, not to till the soil his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. It was magnificent and terrifying all at once. Jed saw a piece of machinery that could do the work of 3 tractors, but he also saw a bank payment the size of a mortgage, due every month, rain or shine, high prices or low. He kept driving, the rumble of his old truck a comforting sound. He thought about what Vance had said. Junk, museum pieces. Was he a fool? Was his father, who had preached the gospel of a paid-for farm his entire life, wrong? Had the world changed so much that the old rules no longer applied? Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you folks listening, have you ever had to choose between taking on a big debt for something new and shiny, or sticking with the old, reliable thing you already owned and knew how to fix? It could be a car, a house, a tool. Let me know in the comments below, because Jed Stone was living that question every single day, and the whole county was watching to see his answer. Back at his own farm, the answer was waiting for him in the machine shed. The shed was old, built by his grandfather with timber from their own woods, but the concrete floor was clean swept and the tools were hung in their proper places. And there, in the center bay, sat his 1968 John Deere 4020. It wasn't a monster like the Steiger. It was a classic, a legend, a side console with the synchro-range transmission. Its green paint was faded on the hood from 30 years of sun, and the fenders were scuffed and dinged from encounters with fence posts and tree branches. The seat was cracked, patched with silver duct tape. To Rick Vance, it was scrap iron. To Jed, it was the farm's beating heart. He knew every bolt on it, every grease zerk, every quirk of its 6-cylinder diesel engine. He knew that on a cold morning you had to give it just a whisper of ether to get it to fire. He knew the 3rd gear synchro was a little weak, and you had to double-clutch it just so. He'd rebuilt the engine himself 5 years ago, right here on this floor, honing the cylinders and plastigaging the bearings until they were perfect. The tractor was an extension of himself. It held the memory of his father, teaching him how to plow a straight furrow, the sweat of 1,000 summer days, the satisfaction of 1,000 completed tasks. It owed him nothing, and he owed it nothing. They were partners. The next spring, Jed's partnership with his old iron was put to the test. He was in the middle of planting corn, the 40-20 pulling his 6-row international planter through the rich black soil of the North 80. The diesel engine sang its familiar, throaty song, a rhythm he'd known his whole life. He was making good time, the rows laying out behind him straight as a chalk line. Then, as he went to lift the planter on the headland, he felt it. a hesitation. The hydraulics whined a higher pitch than usual, a sound of strain. The planter arms came up, but they were slow, sluggish, like a man waking from a deep sleep. Jed's stomach knotted. He knew that sound. He dropped the planter, shut down the tractor, and climbed out. He walked to the front of the tractor and checked the hydraulic fluid level. It was fine. He checked the lines for leaks. Nothing. He climbed back into the seat, his mind racing. He tried the steering. It was heavy, stiff. The power steering was running off the same main hydraulic pump. It was internal. The pump was going. He sat there for a long moment, the silence of the field pressing in on him. In the distance, on the next section over, he could hear the deep, guttural roar of a big diesel engine. Vance's Steiger. He could picture it, pulling that massive planter, eating up acres like a hungry beast, never stopping, never breaking. A wave of frustration washed over him. Vance was right. He was out here, dead in the water, with 100 acres of corn left to plant, and a forecast calling for rain in 2 days. The smart thing, the modern thing, would be to call the Deere dealership. They'd send a man out with a new pump and a bill for $500, and he'd be running by morning. $500 he'd have to borrow from the bank. Jed shook his head, clearing the thought away. He wasn't going to do it. He drove the tractor, its steering groaning in protest, back to the machine shed. He backed the planter out of the way and positioned the 40-20 in the center of the concrete floor, right under the chain hoist that hung from the main beam. The job was a brute. The hydraulic pump on a 4-2 is tucked away behind the front grille, right in front of the radiator. First, he had to drain all 12 gallons of high-guard transmission and hydraulic fluid. The thick amber oil smelled of work and heat as it gurgled into his drain pans. Then came the disassembly. He removed the grill, the side panels, the battery tray. He carefully disconnected the radiator hoses, catching the sweet-smelling green coolant in a bucket. With the radiator out of the way, he could finally see the pump, a heavy, cast-iron chunk of precision engineering. He spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously unbolting the hydraulic lines, labeling each one with a piece of masking tape, so he'd remember where it went. The fittings were tight, frozen by years of heat and pressure. He had to use a cheetah bar on his wrench, his muscles straining until they broke free with a sharp crack. Finally, he got the 4 main mounting bolts loose. The pump weighed nearly 80 pounds, and wrestling it out of the tractor's tight confines was a greasy, knuckle-busting affair. He got it onto his workbench just as the sun was setting, staining the western sky orange and purple. He was covered in grease, his back ached, and he hadn't planted a single kernel of corn all afternoon. He flicked on the bare bulb that hung over the bench. Under the harsh light, the pump looked like a patient on an operating table. He spent the next 2 hours taking it apart, piece by careful piece. He laid out the gears, the housing, the pressure plates, and the seals on a clean rag in the exact order he removed them. He cleaned every part in his solvent tank, the sharp chemical smell stinging his nostrils. Using a set of feeler gauges and a micrometer, he started measuring. The diagnosis came quickly. The main housing was scored. Deep grooves were carved into the metal where the gears had been chewing away at it, a sign of wear and contamination. The pump wasn't just worn out, it was destroyed. A new pump from Deere was out of the question. He'd be looking at a week's wait and a bill that would make his eyes water. The next morning, he was on the phone to Miller's salvage yard, a sprawling 20-acre field of rusted, cannibalized farm equipment 20 miles away. "Got a 40-20 in here last week, Jed," Old Man Miller's gravelly voice crackled over the line. "Diesel, side console. Pump should be the same. I'll sell it to you for $75, but it's as is. You pull it." It was the best news he'd had in a day. He spent the morning at the salvage yard, lying in the mud under the carcass of a wrecked tractor, fighting the same rusty bolts he'd fought the day before. He brought the replacement pump home, cleaned it, inspected it, and found it to be in good shape. He spent the afternoon carefully reassembling it with a new set of gaskets and seals that cost him $12 at the local auto parts store. By evening, he was wrestling the heavy pump back into his 40-20. His hands were shaking with fatigue, but he worked with a slow, deliberate pace. He got everything bolted back up, the lines reconnected, the radiator installed. He filled the system with fresh, high-guard fluid, pouring the expensive oil in slowly, carefully. It was nearly midnight when he was finally done. The machine shed was quiet, except for the chirping of crickets outside. He climbed into the seat, his whole body aching. He took a deep breath and turned the key. The starter ground for a moment, and then the big 6-cylinder diesel roared to life. Jed let it idle, his hand on the steering wheel, his eyes on the hydraulic pressure gauge. The needle flickered, then climbed steadily into the green. He nudged the 3-point hitch lever. The arms rose smoothly, quickly, with no hesitation. He turned the steering wheel. It was light as a feather, responding instantly. A grin split his tired, grease-stained face. He'd done it. Total cost, $87 and 2 days of his own sweat and blood. He shut the engine off and sat in the ringing silence, a feeling of profound satisfaction washing over him. It was a feeling Rick Vance, with his new Steiger and his dealership service plan, would never know. The next day, Jed was back in the field, the 40-20 running better than it had in years. He finished his planting just as the first drops of the promised rain began to fall. But he had lost time. At the co-op diner the next week, the talk was all about Rick Vance. "Did you see him out there?" one farmer said over his coffee. "Looked like a battleship sailing across that field. They say he planted his whole 1,200 acres in 3 days. And I hear he just bought the old Miller place," another added. "Another 240 acres. The bank's backing him all the way. That boy's going to own the whole county one of these days." Jed sat in his usual booth, stirring his coffee, listening. No one asked him how his planting went. They'd all seen his tractor sitting in the shed for 2 days. They'd seen him driving his pickup to the salvage yard. In their eyes, he was falling behind, a relic tinkering with his antiques while the world moved on. He was the cautionary tale they told their sons. Don't be like Jed Stone. Think bigger. The years that followed seemed to prove them right. The mid-70s were a golden age for American agriculture. Russian grain deals and a weak dollar sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Land values doubled, then tripled. It was a heady, intoxicating time, a fever that swept through the heartland. And Rick Vance rode the crest of that wave like a champion. Every year he bought more land, always with the bank's enthusiastic support. His operation swelled to over 2,000 acres. The Steiger Tiger II was traded in for an even bigger Panther model. A new, larger grain bin complex rose on his farmstead, gleaming in the sun. He bought a new house in town. He was the poster boy for the new way of farming, featured in magazines, his opinion sought by reporters. He was proof that debt was not a burden, but a tool, a jet engine that could launch a man to incredible heights. Jed, meanwhile, continued on his own quiet path. The good prices were good for him, too. He was making more money than he ever had. But instead of leveraging it, he used it to kill his debt. He made extra payments on his farm mortgage, the one his father had taken out 20 years before. He paid it down aggressively, chunk by chunk. He didn't deny himself everything. He bought a slightly newer combine, a Gleaner G, but he found a well-maintained one at an auction and paid cash for it. He invested in his land, tiling a wet spot in the south field, building up the soil with lime and potash. His yields were as good as anyone's, sometimes better. But his balance sheet was the only place he was growing. To the outside world, he looked stagnant. He still lived in the same modest farmhouse his grandfather had built. He still drove the same old Ford pickup, and he still farmed his original 600 acres with his John Deere 4020. The talk at the co-op continued. They didn't call him a fool anymore, not to his face. They just looked at him with a kind of pity. Poor old Jed, scared of his own shadow. He could be a millionaire by now if he'd just had a little more nerve. He was a man out of time, a farmer playing by his father's rules in a world that had completely rewritten the playbook. One fall afternoon, Jed was at the grain elevator, waiting in line to unload his corn. Rick Vance's brand-new semi-truck was in front of him, getting weighed. Vance himself climbed down from the cab, looking restless and important. He saw Jed sitting in his old grain truck and sauntered over. "Still making do with that old thing, Jed?" Vance asked, nodding at the 4020 parked back at the farm. "I heard you finally paid off your daddy's mortgage. Congratulations. Must be nice to own your little patch of dirt free and clear." There was a condescending edge to his voice, the tone of a king speaking to a commoner. "It's a good feeling, Rick," Jed said evenly. "I bet," Vance said with a smirk. "Me, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. Just signed the papers on another half section. The bank loves me. But you know what they say. You gotta spend money to make money." He clapped Jed on the shoulder. "You ought to try it sometime. It's a hell of a ride." Jed just watched him walk away. A hell of a ride, he thought. But rides always come to an end. That evening, sitting at his kitchen table, Jed listened to the news on the radio. The announcer's voice was grave. He was talking about inflation, something Jed didn't fully understand, but he knew it meant the price of everything was going up. Fuel, seed, parts. Then the announcer mentioned a name Jed had never heard before. Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. He spoke of a new economic policy, of a commitment to slaying the dragon of inflation, no matter the cost. The tool, he said, would be interest rates. The prime lending rate, the number the bank used as a base, had just ticked up to 12%. A few months ago, it had been 8%. The announcer said some economists were predicting it could go much, much higher. Jed turned the radio off. The kitchen was silent. He looked out the window, across his own dark fields, toward the horizon where the yard lights of Rick Vance's massive mortgaged empire glowed against the night sky. For the first time, Jed didn't see a symbol of success. He saw a skyscraper built on a fault line, and deep in the earth he could feel the first, faint tremor of the coming quake. The tremor Jed felt that night was not a fleeting thing. It was the slow, grinding start of a tectonic shift that would buckle the very landscape of American agriculture. The following summer, the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue, and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked, grey plate. The corn, which had sprung up full of promise in June, began to suffer. By mid-July, the leaves were curling inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture remained. The farmers of Redwood County began to look to the sky, not with hope, but with a kind of weary accusation. Jed felt the drought in the ache of his bones, but his farm was better prepared than most. The tiling he'd invested in years ago helped the soil retain what little moisture it held. He spent long, dusty hours on the seat of his 40-20, pulling an old 4-row cultivator between the corn rows, breaking up the crust on the soil to create a dust mulch that slowed evaporation. It was a slow, tedious job, one that the big operators like Vance had abandoned years ago in favor of chemical weed control. They called it recreational tillage. For Jed, it was survival. The 4020, with its narrow front tires, sipped diesel fuel, and when a bearing went out on the cultivator, Jed forged a new bushing in his shop and had it back in the field in an hour. One sweltering afternoon, he was working the field that bordered Rick Vance's land. Across the fence, Vance's corn was visibly suffering more than his own. The stands were thinner, the leaves a paler shade of green. In the distance, he saw the giant Steiger panther sitting motionless in the middle of a half-worked field. It had been there for 2 days. Curiosity finally got the better of him. He shut down his own tractor and walked over, the dry dirt crunching under his boots. He found Vance standing beside the enormous machine, staring at a dark pool of oil that had collected on the ground beneath its articulated joint. Vance's face was grim, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out anxiety. The dealership cap was pushed back on his head, and his shirt was dark with sweat. "What's the trouble, Rick?" Jed asked, keeping his voice neutral. Vance kicked one of the massive tires, a gesture of pure frustration. "Damn transmission! Planetary gear set in the rear axle, let go. Took out the whole final drive. It's shredded." He gestured at the puddle of oil, which was thick with the glitter of metal shavings. "Dealer was just out here. Said it's a $20,000 repair, minimum, and the parts have to come from the factory in Fargo. Might be 2 weeks, might be a month." Jed whistled softly. $20,000. It was more than he'd paid for his combine. "That's a tough break." "Tough break?" Vance laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "It's a catastrophe, Jed. I've got 800 acres of beans to spray, and this thing is my only big horse. The bank is breathing down my neck for a payment, fuel prices are through the roof, and now this monster." He looked at the silent green tractor, not with pride, but with a kind of raw hatred. "It's supposed to be the best, the most powerful, but when it breaks you." Jed looked from the crippled giant to his own 4020, patiently idling a quarter-mile away, a small but faithful servant. He thought about the $75 hydraulic pump he'd pulled from a salvage yard. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He just nodded, turned, and walked back to his own field, the silence of Vance's broken dream echoing behind him. The cracks in Vance's empire began to show all over the county. A load of fertilizer he'd ordered was held up at the co-op for non-payment. He was late paying his custom harvesting bill from the year before. The talk at the diner shifted from admiration of his expansion to hushed speculation about his finances. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what was left of the weakened crops, adding insult to injury. Harvest that year was a grim affair. Yields were down by half, but the real earthquake hit that winter. The news from the Federal Reserve was no longer just a tremor. It was a magnitude 9 event. To combat runaway inflation, Paul Volcker and the Fed pushed the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21.5%. For farmers like Rick Vance, who had built their empires on variable rate operating loans, it was a death sentence. His loan payments didn't just increase, they tripled, almost overnight. At the same time, a grain embargo against the Soviet Union was announced in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The bottom fell out of the commodities market. Corn prices that had been over $3 a bushel plummeted to less than $2. Farmers were caught in an impossible vice: the highest borrowing costs in history, paired with the lowest crop prices in a decade. The golden age was over. The farm crisis had begun. The first auction notices appeared in the county paper like obituaries. Family farms that had been passed down for generations were suddenly being sold on the courthouse steps. The Redwood County Farmers Trust, once so eager to lend, was now just as eager to foreclose. Mr. Henderson's practiced smile was replaced with a somber, apologetic mask as he explained to lifelong customers that the bank had no choice. Jed was insulated from the worst of it. With his mortgage paid off and no operating debt, the high interest rates were an abstraction, something he read about in the paper. The low grain prices hurt, but he had bins full of corn and soybeans from the good years, grain that was paid for. He sold just enough to cover his taxes and living expenses, tightening his belt and waiting for the storm to pass. He watched as his neighbors, good men who had followed the advice of bankers and experts, were swept away. The biggest casualty was Rick Vance. His massive debt load became an anchor that pulled him under with breathtaking speed. The $20,000 repair bill for the Steiger was just the beginning. The skyrocketing interest on his land and equipment loans was the final, fatal blow. One chilly spring morning, Jed drove past Vance's farmstead and saw it. A large, professionally printed sign hammered into the front lawn. "Public auction," it declared in bold red letters. Below, it listed the assets to be liquidated: 2,400 acres of prime farmland, a full line of late-model high-horsepower equipment, grain handling facilities, and the family home. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a bitter wind that whipped across the farmyard, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. Half the county was there. They moved in a somber, silent herd, picking through the machinery lined up in neat rows like soldiers on a final, doomed parade. There was no joy in it, no thrill of the bargain. It felt like a wake. Jed saw Rick Vance standing alone by the machine shed, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked 10 years older. His wife was nearby, trying to comfort their 2 small children who didn't understand why hundreds of strangers were walking through their home. Jed's heart ached for them. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, started with the smaller items: tools, shop equipment, pickup trucks. Then he moved to the machinery. The prices were brutally low. A nearly new John Deere combine, one that Vance had paid over $100,000 for, sold for 30 cents on the dollar. Men who were struggling to keep their own farms afloat didn't have the cash or the credit to bid. Finally, the auctioneer led the crowd to the centerpiece of the sale, the Steiger Panther. It had been repaired, its engine gleaming, but it stood as a monument to a failed dream. "All right, folks, here she is," the auctioneer boomed, his voice straining for enthusiasm. "The king of the field! 4-wheel drive, 350 horses of pure power. Who will start the bidding at $50,000? 50,000, do I hear 50? Silence. The crowd just stared at the massive machine. $50,000 was an impossible sum. More than that, the tractor had become a symbol of the very hubris that had led to this disaster. It was too big, too complex, too thirsty for fuel, too expensive to fix. In this new era of brutal austerity, it was a dinosaur. 40,000, the auctioneer pleaded. "Give me 40, 30. Folks, this machine cost $250,000 new." More silence. A farmer near Jed muttered to his friend, "What in God's name would I do with that thing? It's too heavy for my fields, and I'd have to sell the farm to pay for one tire." Finally, a scrapper from out of state offered $5,000, his bid hanging in the cold air like an insult. The auctioneer tried desperately to get another bid, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw only grim, pitying faces. "Sold!" he finally barked, slamming his hand down. For $5,000 to the man from the scrap yard. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The Steiger, Rick Vance's pride and joy, the symbol of the new era of farming, had sold for scrap value. Jed watched as the scrapper walked over and slapped a magnetic "tagged for scrap" sign on its giant green hood. The sound was a dull, final thud. Jed didn't stay for the sale of the land. He couldn't bear to watch. He knew what would happen. Big money investors and insurance companies, the only ones with cash, would buy it up for a fraction of its worth. The land would no longer be farmed by a family who loved it, but by a hired man working for a distant corporation. Instead of going home, Jed drove into town, straight to the Redwood County Farmers Trust. He walked past the teller windows and knocked on Mr. Henderson's office door. The banker looked up, his face etched with the strain of the times. "Jedediah," he said, his voice tired. "What can I do for you?" Jed sat down in the leather chair across the desk, the same chair where men had their dreams either financed or foreclosed. "I'm here about the Vance farm," Jed said, his voice quiet but firm. "The home quarter, the 160 acres with the house and the barns." Henderson sighed. "It's a tragedy, Jedediah. A real tragedy. But my hands are tied. The sale is today." "I know," Jed said. "The bank is going to take a loss on that whole operation, isn't it? Even after the auction." Henderson nodded grimly. "A significant loss." "I want to make you an offer," Jed continued. "I'll buy the home quarter. I'll pay what Rick's father paid for it 30 years ago. Not today's prices, not yesterday's prices. The original price. It'll be more than you'll get for it at the auction today, and it will be a cash deal. I'll use my own farm as collateral for a small, short-term loan to cover the difference of what I have in savings." Henderson leaned forward, intrigued. He pulled out the thick Vance file and did some quick calculations on a notepad. He looked at Jed, a new kind of respect dawning in his eyes. "That's a fair offer, Jedediah. A very fair offer. It would help the bank mitigate some of its losses." "There's one condition," Jed said. "The paperwork has to be drawn up so that Rick and his family can continue to live in the house. He can rent the land and buildings from me. We can work out the terms later, but I want his family to stay in their home." The banker stared at Jed for a long moment, the silence in the room thick with the weight of the years of advice he'd given, advice that had led so many to ruin. He saw in Jed not a backward-thinking fool, but a man of profound and simple wisdom, a man who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in acres or horsepower, but in security, community, and compassion. "I'll draw up the papers myself," Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion. Jed left the bank in silence. There was no fanfare, no congratulations. He walked out into the cold afternoon, the paper receipt for his down payment folded in his pocket. It felt more solid, more real than any title to a new machine. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't taken advantage. He had simply done what a neighbor ought to do. It was a vindication far deeper than any "I told you so." In the weeks and months that followed, the story of what Jed had done spread through the county. The perspective began to shift. The men at the co-op diner no longer looked at Jed with pity. They looked at him with a quiet, deep-seated respect. They had all chased the same dream as Rick Vance, and it had nearly destroyed them. Jed had stayed his course, and he had endured. He became an anchor in the storm. Farmers started stopping by his machine shed, not to mock his old equipment, but to ask for his help. "Jed, my old case is making a funny noise in the transmission. The dealer wants $1,000 just to look at it. You got any ideas?" "Jed, I can't afford new injectors for my Alice. You think we could rebuild these?" His shop became a community hub, a place of greasy hands and shared knowledge, where men kept their operations alive with salvaged parts and Jed's quiet expertise. He never charged much, often just trading his labor for a pie from a neighbor's wife or help fixing a fence. He was rebuilding his community, one busted tractor at a time. Rick Vance, humbled and grateful, took Jed's offer. He farmed the home quarter with a set of older, smaller equipment he bought for cash. He and Jed never spoke directly about the auction or the bank, but an understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of crisis. Rick learned the quiet satisfaction of fixing a machine with his own hands, of ending a year with a small profit instead of a mountain of new debt. He learned to farm like Jed Stone. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip. Prices recovered. Land values stabilized. The world moved on. Jed never got rich. He never expanded beyond the home farm and the one quarter he had bought to save his neighbor. He didn't need to. He was already wealthy in all the ways that mattered. One sunny fall afternoon, well into the next decade, Jed was in his shop with his teenage son, Daniel. They were bent over the engine of the 40-20, doing a valve adjustment. The tractor's green paint was even more faded now, its fenders bearing new scars, but the engine ran as sweet as the day it was built. "Hand me the 13/16 wrench, son," Jed said, pointing with a greasy finger. Daniel passed him the tool. "Dad," he asked, "why do we still use this old tractor? All my friends' dads have new ones with cabs and air conditioning and radios." Jed stopped his work. He wiped his hands on a red rag and looked at his son, his eyes full of a gentle wisdom. "This tractor," he said, laying a hand on the warm green hood, "taught me everything I know. It taught me how to be a mechanic. It taught me how to be patient. But the most important thing it taught me is that you should never owe the bank for something you can't live without." He pointed out the open shed door across the fields. "You see that land? We own it. You see these tools? We own them. This tractor? We own it. That means we answer to no one but God and the weather. When times are good, we save. When times are bad, we survive. There are men, richer men than me, who will never know the peace of mind that comes with that. They own bigger farms, but their farms own them." Just then, a pickup truck pulled into the yard. It was Rick Vance. He got out, a smile on his face, and walked toward the shop. "Jedediah," he called out, "just wanted to drop off the rent check, and Mary sent over a fresh apple pie." "You didn't have to do that, Rick," Jed said, taking the pie. "I know," Rick replied, his eyes drifting to the 40,020. "Just wanted to. Heard you two working on the old girl. She's still running strong." "Always," Jed said with a grin. "Some things are built to last." The two men stood there for a moment, a comfortable silence between them, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. In that quiet moment, Daniel understood. He looked at the old John Deere, not as an antique, but as a legacy. It wasn't just a machine of iron and steel. It was a vessel of wisdom, a teacher of resilience, and the quiet, rumbling heart of a farm that had weathered the storm and would stand for generations to come.